From preventing nuclear attacks in the middle of the sea to a ridiculous inflatable plane, here are 10 of the biggest unusual planes in the world. Number 10. The Bartini-Beriev VVA-14. The Bartini-Beriev VVA-14 is a seriously bizarre aircraft. According to War History Online, it was constructed as part of the arms race during the Cold War. The whole theory behind this craft was that it could combat threats from the middle of the sea and thereby prevent nuclear missile strikes. In 1970, this strange amphibian aircraft was born as a means to defend the mighty Soviet Union. It was made to take off and land vertically, but with the ability to do so from both land and the water. Its primary mission was to detect any American submarine that approached the borders of the USSR. But considering you've probably never heard of this machine, it obviously didn't turn out very well. It was designed by a famous Italian who worked as an aviation engineer for the Soviet Union. Bartini was well respected. That is, before he was thrown into the Gulag for 8 years. But after his release, he began building weaponized vehicles again for the USSR. This particular aircraft never really did what it was supposed to do. After its initial test flight, Bartini had to make quite a few corrections. The biggest issue was taking off vertically. However, the airplane did function. It spent roughly 103 hours in the air with a total of 107 flights. But in 1976, the project was halted and the prototype was sent to the Soviet Central Air Force Museum, where it still sits today. It just never proved that useful. Number 9. AD-1 Oblique Wing. The AD-1 Oblique Wing was an aircraft designed with a sideways wing. Also known as an oblique wing, it was designed to rotate on a center pivot so that it could be set at whichever angle was the most effective for the speed that the airplane was flying. It was designed by an aeronautical engineer from NASA as part of a theory that said using an oblique wing could gift an aircraft twice the fuel economy when compared to conventional wings. Researchers from the Dryden Flight Research Center flew this airplane a total of only 79 times, according to NASA. Although the oblique style of wing is still considered a viable concept today for large transports, the aircraft exhibited far too many unpleasant flying characteristics, and this discouraged aircraft designers from ever adopting the configuration. Basically, it's indeed a smart idea, but it's simply way too annoying to apply on any conventional plane. And so, this clever idea has been scrapped. What's the strangest flying experience you've ever had? Have you ever gone skydiving? Or perhaps just a flight in a private plane? Hang gliding counts too, you know. Go on and tell me all about your experience in the comments below. Then be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. There are loads of amazing videos coming out all the time right here on American Eye, and if you don't subscribe, you're gonna miss them. Number 8. The Flying Tank. It seems like a natural thing to combine an airplane with a tank. After all, these are two of the most important fighting machines we have on our planet. And during World War II, somebody tried to do it. As the war progressed, the ideas on both sides got a little wackier each day, and the flying tank was one of the crazy designs attempted. The whole idea behind this airplane and tank hybrid was that it could fly onto the battlefield very quickly and then detach the tank from its wings. If it had worked, it would have given the Russian army the ability to touch down a whole fleet of tanks far quicker than if they had to drive them across the ground. The initial prototype was also designed so that it could take out bombers flying at low altitudes, then fly over enemy lines and flank them from behind. There was only one prototype built in 1942, and it was done by combining one of the lightest Russian tanks, which at the time was the T-60, with fabricated biplane wings and a twin tail. The airplane was designed without an engine, as it was supposed to be used as a glider that flew at low altitudes. However, the big issue was that the tank was just too heavy. In September of 1942, the prototype tried to take flight, but the drag was way too much for the wooden biplane wings. It turned out to be a complete disaster, with the experimental pilot having to detach from the wings and make a landing inside of the tank. Luckily, the guy only suffered a few minor injuries. Afterward, the project was abandoned. Number 7. CONVAIR XFY-1 POGO. The CONVAIR XFY-1 POGO looks like something a child would design. It was one of many attempts after World War II to create a vertical takeoff and vertical landing combat vehicle. The British did succeed eventually, but before they did, the United States experimented with several different configurations. The POGO was one of them. The whole point behind this vehicle was that it could launch vertically from destroyer vessels out at sea. After 4 years of studying, the Navy awarded a contract to CONVAIR to design such an aircraft. This was in 1951. The XFY-1 POGO was made, and it was actually pretty good. It could take off and land vertically, and it could also transition into horizontal flight and back. But it also came with a whole bunch of problems. Flying the vehicle required phenomenal piloting skills and special training, and it proved to be far more complicated than it was worth. The concept was theoretically possible, but there was way too much work involved in flying the craft. And so, in 1956, the Navy shut down the program and all the funding vanished. Then, in 1973, the one and only prototype was transferred to the National Air and Space Museum, where you can still see it today. It does look pretty cool, but it doesn't seem particularly necessary. It would never get approved as a project today. Number 6. The real flying saucer. Believe it or not, the United States Air Force developed a real flying saucer in the 1950s. The aircraft had been codenamed Project 1794, and it was developed in conjunction between the USAF and a Canadian company. In a newly declassified memo, everyone's theories have been confirmed. UFOs were developed by the United States Air Force. The flying saucer prototype was supposed to be capable of hitting Mach 4 and flying at over 100,000 feet with a range of 1,150 miles. The supersonic flying saucer would have propelled itself by rotating an outer disk at an extremely fast speed, and the maneuvering would have been done by using shutters along the edge of the disk. Power would have been supplied by jet turbines, and the entire system could have taken off and landed vertically. Unfortunately, it's unknown whether the aircraft ever got off the ground or not, but what we do know is that the project was an absolute failure. The only good news from all these declassified documents is that we now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the United States has been working on a literal flying saucer since at least the 1940s, which was actually around the same time as the infamous Roswell UFO incident. Although keep in mind that this flying saucer was designed and built in Canada, not in the US. Number 5. The Goblin. The Goblin was definitely not the biggest unusual aircraft, but it was such a strange idea that it must be mentioned on this list. The proper name for this little vessel was the XF-85 Goblin, and it was the smallest ever jet-propelled fighter. It was actually known as a parasite fighter, since it was designed to be carried inside of a B-36 bomber. In the case of its host ship being attacked, the Goblin was to be released for aerial defense. Basically, think about a giant alien mothership and its hundreds or thousands of tiny fighter drones. Or think about the Death Star and the dozens of fighters defending it. That was the whole idea. As you probably already know, this system didn't last long. The tiny fighter was indeed stable, it was pretty easy to fly, but hooking the Goblin back onto the bomber after it had been deployed was an absolute nightmare. It was actually more dangerous to try and get the parasite fighters back into the bomber than it was worth. Only 3 out of the 7 flights of the Goblin had successful connections according to Boeing themselves. Then in 1949, the program was canceled, and the Goblin went extinct. This project seems like it would be very cool to do today, but smart missiles probably make the need for many fighters totally obsolete. Number 4. Tactic Blue Experimental Stealth Jet. The Tactic Blue Experimental Stealth Jet was part of the HAV Blue program from DARPA. It was also the first ever practical combat stealth aircraft. It all began in the early 1970s as a way to somehow develop stealth technology. There were 2 demonstration aircrafts created by Lockheed, with one of them making its first test flight in 1977. This led to a huge contract and an upscale in engineering that eventually led to the development of the F-117. But first, there was the Tactic Blue, which operated radar sensors while maintaining a very low radar cross-section, meaning it was one of the original aircrafts that had stealth and radar properties. It was a huge innovation in airplanes, and it made its first experimental flight in 1982. Using this original design, which we can all agree looks like a goofy children's toy, the B-2 stealth bomber was eventually developed and then used for the very first time in combat in 1999. Number 3. The X-29 Advanced Aircraft. The X-29 has backward wings. That's what makes this aircraft so unusual. 2 of these aircrafts were flown at the Dryden Flight Research Facility back in the 1980s. This was a time when NASA was investigating an entirely different way of designing aircrafts. You can tell from the photos that this thing is all turned around. It has something known as forward swept wings, which are mounted onto the fuselage. Basically, everything is on backwards. The whole point of the design was that the airplane would be able to maneuver far better than other similar aircrafts. The reverse of airflow would keep the wingtips from stalling at high angles, allowing the X-29 to attack using more advanced techniques than any other aircraft. And it worked! Research results according to NASA showed that the pilots had better control responses compared to other fighter aircrafts. However, the aircraft was aerodynamically unstable, and the US Air Force preferred the newly emerging stealth technology. The X-29 was very cool, and its technology is sound, but the big money companies just weren't going for it. Number 2. The Flying Pancake. Taking one look at the Flying Pancake is enough to know that this ridiculous vehicle is never going to be used in any practical setting. The Flying Pancake is known properly as the Vought V-173, and it was originally designed in the 1940s, when the Navy was looking for a special fighter that could be deployed from ships to counter Japanese kamikaze attacks. The result was a fighter that looked like a pancake. The vehicle was super unusual, designed to be round, and it kind of looked like a crab with long stalks. It had enormous wooden propellers driven by a pair of 80-horsepower engines, and it flew for the first time on November 23, 1942. According to Airspace magazine, its test flight was part of a Navy program that would test the lifting capability of very short wings. But there was a huge problem. The propellers were way too big, and the aircraft had to sit at a 22-degree angle, which forced the pilot to look beyond his feet through the window when taking off. The design was actually quite smart for its time though, as the huge propellers allowed the Flying Pancake to take off with just a tiny bit of runway. It could almost levitate on the spot. Unfortunately, after almost 200 flights, the Pancake was retired. It lost out to the more powerful jet engine. The original was restored in 2012 and is now sitting at the Frontiers of Flight Museum until 2022. Number 1. The INFLATOPLANE. The last plane on the list is completely ridiculous. In the 1950s, the United States Army contracted Goodyear to design an aircraft that could be inflated. They wanted to use the aircraft for surveillance and DIY rescue missions. The whole thought was that the inflatable airplane could be dropped to stranded pilots. They could pump it up, then fly themselves out of trouble. 12 inflatoplanes were designed and built, but the concept never really took off. The planes could carry 240 pounds and had a range of 390 miles, cruising at 60 miles per hour. But they were horribly unreliable and easy to burst, seeing as they were literally just fancy balloons. They used a 2-cycle Nelson engine, which could be hand-started and held a maximum 20 gallons of fuel. They worked just fine, but they just weren't realistic. In 1973, the project was canceled. Since then, Goodyear has donated 2 of their famous inflatoplanes, one to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and one to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Which of these unusual planes would you like to take a ride in? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. See you again soon for another fantastic video right here on American Eye.